Hey all, Toast here, and today we are talking about monsters. Monsters in WARCRY have long had the reputation of being broken, overpowered, and generally not all that fun to play against. Now there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case, some of which being that some of them are broken, overpowered, and generally not all that fun to play against. But some does carry a lot of the baggage of that sentence. The truth of the matter is that times have changed, FAQs have dropped, and it's altered the makeup of the game. Players have adapted and just become better at navigating the complex battlefield that is WARCRY's core game design, and maybe monsters aren't as bad as they once were, just because of those changes. So in this video I am going to go over all the monsters in WARCRY one at a time and see which ones are a pain to deal with still, which ones are crap, and which ones are somehow kind of balanced now, and formulate them in some kind of funky tier list kind of thing. But before I get into the crux of the tier list, there are a couple of elephants in the room that universally apply to all monsters that I want to get out of the way now, just so you're aware that these actually are issues with all monsters, no matter how bad they are. Firstly, there's the change in the whole deployment system when you take a monster. This is arguably the biggest strength of any monster, as monsters take up a whole deployment by themselves. So if you are playing with a monster, you don't actually split your warband into 3 equal parts. Instead, you split them into 2 equal parts and place the monster in the 3rd remaining deployment. This consolidation of power means you can have larger deployment groups with a smaller warband. As a rule of thumb, if you have a 7-man warband, you can functionally deploy like you have a 9-man warband. And as a rule of thumb, a list with a monster wants to be 7-man. And the reason for this is that once you have a 7-man warband with a monster, you functionally deploy like you have a 9-man warband. The second elephant follows hot on the heels of deployments, and that's because monsters activate 3 times in one turn, not just once. Sure, they only get 1 action per activation, but activating 3 times means a single model has the economy weight of 3 models. Put simply, if you have a 7-man warband as before, that includes a monster, you have the activation weight of a 9-man warband again. Both of these things combined makes dealing with monsters far more difficult because they are fundamentally changing the core systems of the game. From a competitive WARCRY perspective, things like deployments and activation economy are core pillars of the game, and monsters throw those pillars straight into the bin. And to add fuel to that, if you're not used to playing against monsters, and spoiler, most players aren't, especially if you're a competitive WARCRY player, because most monsters, if not all monsters, are banned across the vast majority of competitive play, then these changes, these facets of monsters continue to shock the system of WARCRY players everywhere, even years into the game's life. The final elephant is of course drag and maul. Monsters don't have access to general abilities and instead have a small list of monster specific abilities that they can all use. Drag and maul is one of them, and it is disgusting. You pick a dude within 6 inches, place them nearby, do a bunch of damage, and if you haven't moved the activation, you even get to attack for even more damage. Considering monster stat lines, the thing that you just dragged is probably going to die. The level of displacement with drag and maul is incredible. It is unmatched by anything else in the game. The range is also incredible, especially once you factor in how big monsters tend to be. The biggest base is over 100mm in size, and with a 6-inch bubble on top of that, they can cover an incredible amount of space on the board. Not to mention the damage is also great, even if it's not the main draw of the ability, and overall Drag and Maul is likely to be the best ability in WARCRY, by a long, long way. And like I said before, all monsters can use Dragon Maul, so even the worst monsters in the game are a potential threat, a serious threat at that. But with all of those elephants out of the way, let's go into each monster, break them down, and see if they are worth taking and how they rank compared to every other monster in the game. These 3 elephants are some killer benefits to monsters, but that doesn't necessarily result in top tier picks for your warband, so let's get into them now. So onto the tier list, and we have our 5 tiers, starting with straight up spice, actually cake, boulangerie bloomer, stale croissant, and of course moldy damper right at the bottom. And you may have noticed we have multiples of some monsters. For example, we have 2 gargants and 2 mutalith vortex beasts. There's a reason for that, and I'll get into that when the time comes. But for now, let's dive right in with the Chimera. And the Chimera is arguably the poster child for why all monsters are banned, and that's because the Chimera, when Warcry first came out, was straight up spice. This thing was broken beyond belief. In fact, I should have put a separate tier for the Chimera just for this section, purely because the Chimera was so good, so broken at its points, because I believe it was like 300-ish points, and this thing dominated the game. You could take any list, and if you had a Chimera, you were likely winning that game if they didn't have a Chimera themselves. It was oppressive to all hell. This fundamentally warped the perception of all monsters in Warcry and resulted in a universal ban of monsters in most places. There are some places that still allow monsters, like Warhammer World and some of the UK events, and maybe some in the US and other parts of Europe too. But for the most part, monsters tend to be shunned, and the Chimera is the main reason for that. And this continued even after the universal nerf of all monsters. Chimeras went up like 200 points, and this thing was still a threatening piece, still one of the best models, if not the best model in the game, even after a 200 point price hike. Which says something, because pick any other model in the game, add on 200 points, and then tell me if it's still good. The answer will be no, 100% of the time, with the sole exception being the freaking Chimera, and frankly, the Chimera stays in straight up spice tier because this thing is movement 12 with fly, with 6 attacks, I believe, at strength 6, 5, 10 damage. This thing's like 2 gut loads in one, but also flies and can attack 15 times in one turn. And the base is shockingly small, so one of the things you'll find out later on in this video is that a lot of these monsters aren't viable or are less viable because their base is too big. Well, the Chimera doesn't care because its base is quite small comparatively, and it has fly. So it can go wherever it wants and just murder whatever it wants. And of course, with Dragon Maul, if it can't get to you, you will come to it and then you will die. It is ridiculously good and it stays in straight up spice. Next up, we have the Saigo, and this is like the artillery piece, the only real artillery piece in Warcry. Because the Saigo basically is a giant catapult of death with like 50 wounds and can heal itself, and also has a massive AoE and does incredible single target damage, and is also decent in combat as well. The Saigo is, I would say, one of the most fun monsters simply because his ability is comical. This thing can do 35 damage on one ability called Hurl Boulder. It's a triple, have to roll pretty well, it's dice reliant, but it caps at 35 damage. What has 30 wounds in Warcry? Basically every massive threat in Warcry has 35 or less wounds. So if this big old boulder hits a Slann, there's a chance that Slann dies. Not only that, but this ability has a massive range, so you can snipe nearly anything you want in the game, which is hilarious. It outranges most other ranged threats. The ability is also not worsened when the Saigo gets weakened, which is a weakness of all monsters, is that they get worse as time goes on. The Saigo does not. There is one balancing factor with the Saigo, and that's that it can't just spam its boulder through. It has to use a triple and then a double to reload, right? So in one turn you can throw a boulder, pick up a boulder, then throw a boulder, but this only really works on turn one because you start the game with a boulder, right? So on turn one, throw, pick up, throw, but then on turn two, it's pick up, throw, pick up. So on turn three, it's then throw, pick up, throw. So every other turn, you could potentially throw 2 boulders in one turn, but this is incredibly expensive. This is like 2 triples and a double every turn to pull off that kind of damage, and they have to be high triples to really pay off. But the Saigo is hilarious because of this. He's also good in combat. You can be in combat, punch things to death whilst throwing boulders. There's nothing stopping you doing that. The Saigo is hilarious. He's my personal favorite monster. He's also not too expensive. He's just over 400 points. And if you want a monster that does something that isn't just straight up murder, in melee at least, the Saigo's that. He's also one of the only monsters that has abilities that you will use that aren't Dragon Maul. You'll be using Hurl Boulder and reload basically constantly. You'll also be using his quad. It's a big AoE of just flat damage. It's a lot of fun. His base is quite small compared to other monsters too. It's fairly narrow, similar to the Chimera. So even though he doesn't have fly, he's still movement 6. And he can get around because of that base, and they fit through terrain a bit easier than other monsters. And of course, because of that incredible range, he doesn't really need to move all that much anyway. So for me, I think that the Saigo is definitely actually cake. Had his abilities been cheaper, straight up spice, but this guy is such an investment of dice. You'll be spending all of your dice on the Saigo, more or less, which means the rest of your warband suffers. They get starved of dice, because the Saigo is so hungry. Next up, we have the Dankhold Troggoth, and this guy recently got a pretty big buff. So he got a massive point reduction. The Dankhold Troggoth was terrible. He was, I think, debatably the worst monster in the game. He was also the cheapest, I believe. So he was cheap, but he was bad, right? You would take anything else that was killy in destruction. You wouldn't even consider taking the Dankhold if monsters were unbanned, just because he was just not good enough. You could just take a Gutlord or a Mollog and get the same effect without that diminishing stat line, right? However, in the most recent FAQ, the Dankhold got a significant decrease in points, and it's the only monster to get this legitimately. So the Dankhold is now like 270-ish points, and at that price point, he is actually really good. He's not straight up spice because he's very killable, he's dealable, you can deal with him. He has a lot of weaknesses, namely his strength is a little bit low. He struggles to kill the biggest things. And of course that diminishing stat line means that he does get worse over time, whereas things like the Gutlord or Mollog or Morgok or a Megaboss, all of which compete at his price point, well, they don't diminish. So taking the Dankhold isn't the go-to thing. You wouldn't always take a Dankhold. What the Dankhold has done though, has opened up monsters to be played again, because he's not the best monster, but he's now cheap enough to take, and he's not broken, which is great. For me, I think the Dankhold is one of the most interesting changes that WARCRY got on the FAQ, because now we're seeing more monsters be considered. They've opened up monsters in some way. It has highlighted the strength of Dragon Maul again. Dragon Maul is disgustingly good, and of course, no matter how cheap or how diminishing a monster becomes, Dragon Maul as a damage piece, as a utility piece, is unmatched. So he still has that, and that's kind of threatening, and that might need some changes going forward, and I hope those changes do come into the game at some point. But even with full power Dragon Maul, the Dankhold feels like a lot of fun to play with, and I haven't had any issues playing against it. So for me, the Dankhold comfortably rests with an actually cake. If he was broken, if he completely warped the game around him like the Chimera, I would put him in straight up spice, but I don't think he's actually done that. I think what he's done is has revitalized monsters in a healthy way that'll hopefully lead to more healthy changes to monsters, such as changes to their abilities and maybe pulling back some of their prices as well. So other monsters are kind of fun to use too. But for now, the Dankhold being the experiment, I think has worked wonderfully, and the Dankhold slots in very nicely into actually cake. So next up we have the Gargant, and we have two. We have the Ale Guzzler Gargant from Destruction and the Chaos Gargant from Chaos, and the reason I have split them is because I do think they are different. Even if their abilities and their stats are identical, the fact they operate within two different Grand Alliances does change their usefulness, because one Grand Alliance might just have better monsters, and therefore it overshadows the Gargant in that respect. So starting with the Ale Guzzler Gargant, I think this thing is actually a Boulangerie Bloomer, because there aren't that many monsters in Destruction. Namely, there's only one more, and that's the Arachnarok Spider, which we'll get to later on. Whereas the Chaos Gargant has loads of options, and frankly, it's not the best out of any of them. For me, the Chaos Gargant is actually a steel croissant. So despite them being identical in every way, I do believe that the options available to Chaos make the Chaos Gargant less viable. However, due to the lack of options for Destruction, the Ale Guzzler is disproportionately better. Of course, he is competing with the Dankhold, who is amazing, which is why he's not actually cake, but I think he's comfortably Boulangerie Bloomer, and he's definitely better than the Chaos Gargant, in my opinion. Their abilities as well are kind of fun on these two. They've got a really fun like headbutt that does massive flat damage. They've got a really fun movement ability called Drunken Stagger, I believe it's called. So they move in really erratic ways. These are really fun monsters because their abilities are just so thematic, but they're not the best. They've got good wounds, good strength, good damage. There's just better monsters out there. One of their biggest strengths, of course, is that they are not too expensive at like 420 points. They are one of the cheaper monsters out there. They're just not outstanding. You would take a different monster in most cases, especially if you're playing Chaos, right? And I think one of the main reasons why the Chaos Gargant struggles is that it's up against the Cygor, actually cake, the Chimera in straight up spice, and the Gorgon, who is also straight up spice. These are like the three main Chaos monsters, and they overshadow the Chaos Gargant dramatically. The Gorgon often gets overlooked, right? So the Gorgon statistically can fight a Chimera and win. One of the only monsters in the game that can actually do that in a straight up fight. His stats are incredible. His base is narrow. He's quite fast. He can buff his own speed. And he has access to Rampage, which is fantastic because most monsters don't have access to Rampage. So the Gorgon can unleash his incredible attack profile more reliably than anyone else. And of course, he's got Dragon Maul, and he overshadows the Chaos Gargant in every conceivable way, and is not even that much more expensive to take. And for me, that really pushes the Chaos Gargant down here. And the Gorgon, for me, is straight up spice. He is one of the best monsters in the game. He doesn't see much play because the Chimera exists, but that's because the Chimera has more of a reputation. People have forgotten the power of the Gorgon, and the Gorgon is substantial when it comes to raw power. So for me, straight up spice for that lad. The Hell Pit Abomination is an interesting choice though. So the Hell Pit is woundsy. It can do damage if you attack it. It can heal itself. It's got quite a powerful heal, in fact. Similar to how the Dankhold can heal, the Hell Pit can also heal. For me, I think the Hell Pit is Boulangerie Bloomer. I don't think it's anywhere near actually cake, but I don't think it's steel croissant. It's got a lot of strengths, namely its abilities, like we mentioned. But its weaknesses are its massive base. It doesn't have fly, even though it is quite fast. But its strength is only strength 4. So you're forced to bless it with +1 strength, but that only takes it to 5. So it's really going to struggle to kill those tougher things in the game. And if you're spending that many points on a monster, you really want that monster to punch through even the biggest things in the game. And the Hell Pit will struggle. The only time I would consider the Hell Pit higher than Boulangerie Bloomer, and maybe sneaking into actually cake, is if you are taking Cypher Lords, because uniquely the Hell Pit Abomination has the minion rune mark in addition to its other rune marks, and this allows the Cypher Lords to teleport the Hell Pit Abomination. And the Cypherload's teleport is board wide. So you can pull the Hellpit from anywhere on the board and then place him very aggressively within, I believe, 6 inches of the thing that just teleported it. And there are multiple teleporters within Cypherloads. So Cypherloads uniquely have a very powerful synergy with the Hellpit. And that might take it to actually kick because you remove one of the biggest weaknesses, and the weakness being the movement. You no longer have to move the Hellpit. You teleport this thing into combat. So in that very specific scenario, actually kick. But in any other scenario, actually kick is way too high. And actually, now that I think about it, Belongi Bloomer might be too high. So possibly still a Croissant. It's got the wounds, it's got the heal, it's quite damaging, right? But without the teleport, without that movement, I think it's going to struggle. And even compared to a Gargant, actually, I would consider it worse than a Gargant. Do a Moldy Damper the Hellpit? Maybe. Like when I properly think about it, possibly. I'm going to be safe. I'm going to put in Steel Croissant. I don't think it's the worst monster in the game. I don't think that. But I think Steel Croissant's safe. In Cypherloads, it's sort of like Vias between Boulangerie and actually Cake. But in most cases, we'll say Steel Croissant. It's a difficult one because he's got a weird stat line that I'm not entirely sure of. Onto our first order monster, and we have the War Hydra, and I think the War Hydra is comfortably actually cake. This thing can revive, of course it can drag and maul, its base isn't that big, it's got a good attack profile, it's got an AoE ability so it can burn things, it can deal with hordes effectively, it's not too expensive, and Order can take some pretty large lists with the War Hydra, namely the Hunters of Huanxi can take the War Hydra very well. They can take a 9-man list with the War Hydra, and if we take the maths from before, a 9-man list is actually got the activation weight and the deployment consolidation of an 11-man list, which is insane to think about when your warband with a monster has the scope of an 11-man warband, which is a horde warband. That's veering into horde territory. So the War Hydra is pretty darn spicy, and we see the War Hydra cropping up more and more, especially in the UK, where monsters are less restricted. And yeah, the War Hydra is one of the more common monsters that you will see, because it's pretty darn good. And in a similar vein, the Charybdis is also actually cake. Now, you don't see the Charybdis very often because the War Hydra is more killy, right? It has that AoE ability that's very nice to have. The Charybdis doesn't have that. I believe the Charybdis also can't regenerate its wounds, so it's a little bit more vulnerable, even if their actual attack stats, I believe, are identical. And I think the Charybdis is slightly cheaper, like 5 points, or the War Hydra is cheaper by 5 points. One of them is cheaper than the other, but the War Hydra sees more play. The Charybdis is still very good though, and is definitely actually cake, and this is because of its unique gimmick, which is a massive AoE net. So you can net a whole warband, potentially. The range is quite substantial on a base this big, so you can just hit a massive chunk of the board, and then potentially you could net 2, 3, 4 models, and that completely changes the game. If you're netting that many models, if you're into a horde, you know, like 5, even 6 models, it's very doable, especially in like massive hordes that deploy with 5 guys in one objective on turn 2. If you take the Charybdis there, you can net all of them and then some mates elsewhere. And then you lock down a massive chunk of the board so the rest of your warband can act freely. And that's incredible, especially when this thing can still kill you. It's very killy still. It's still a monster. It's still a War Hydra stats, which are very spicy. So the Charybdis is like your support monster. The Hydra is pure all-out damage, and the Charybdis is support. And the support that the Charybdis gives is substantial. This thing is incredible, and it's only a matter of time before, if monsters become more common, before people go, oh damn, that Charybdis, yeah, I want to take that, because it's really, really good. To me, I actually think the Charybdis is better than the War Hydra, and the War Hydra dominance in the monster scene is deserved because it's so good, but the Charybdis is slept on so much. It's so good. I absolutely love this thing. It's not straight up spice. I don't think it has quite the same impact as a Chimera or a Gorgon for straight up murder potential. But that net has some real clutch players. You need to be really careful. If you're playing into one, your whole warband could be completely nerfed for a whole turn, and you do not want that. Sadly, the Strand Arachnarok, this thing's a moldy damper, which is a shame. I think it's the first moldy damper we have, and that is because the thing's too big. If memory serves, the Arachnarok Spider has the biggest base in all of WARCRY. I believe it's 150 millimeters. On some missions, just to put into context, that base is so large it could actually capture 4 objectives at once. If they were close enough to the center, and there are a couple that do this, you could place your Arachnarok right in the middle and capture all 4 at once. That's how big this thing's base is. It is comically large. And with Dragon Maul, this thing covers practically the whole board with its threat. Now, the issue with the Arachnarok is, sadly, its stats aren't great. It's got a lot of wounds, but its strength's a little bit low. Its attack stats are a little bit on the middling side compared to the best monsters in the game. But that base is a huge hindrance. Because, yes, the theoretical I stand in the middle where, hey, let's go, exists. But can you get there? And honestly, not really. The Arachnarok does have the ability to ignore terrain with one of its abilities, but its base is so cumbersome that even with that, you still might not be able to legally move from your deployment zone. In fact, if your board is sufficiently terrain dense, you might not be able to legally place your Arachnarok anywhere on the board, which is devastating, right? The Arachnarok is so big, so cumbersome that you simply can't move it, and that makes it practically unplayable. So moldy damper for sure. And then we get to the Slaughter Brute, and the Slaughter Brute's terrible. In a similar way, it's to the Hell Pit. The Slaughter Brute just has no strength. Its damage is too low. Its abilities aren't great. I believe it has a Rampage in there, but it's like if you want Rampage, you'll just take this thing. It's competing for the murder in Chaos, right? And it's competing against the Chimera and the Gorgon and the Cygor, and it does not hold up. I think that the Slaughter Brute is just... he's way too expensive. I believe he's more expensive than the Gorgon, and the stats do not indicate that at all. I think he's terribly pointed and not even worth considering. But then we get into our first death, and we have the Terrorgeist. And the Terrorgeist is pretty good. I think the Terrorgeist goes into actually cake. Maybe. No. I'm going to Belandry Bloomer him. I'll explain why in a second, but the strengths of the Terrorgeist are that it has a pretty big AoE. It's not the most reliable AoE going out there, but it's still a big old scream thing that does potential damage to things, and that damage can be quite high. So that's pretty strong. Its stats are great. We're talking like 50 wounds. It's movement 12 and fly, which is big win there. Movement 12 fly is very, very big. And its attack stats are great, right? It hits hard. It flies. It's got all the strengths you would want in a monster. The issue is, similar to the Arachnarok, its base is ginormous. We're talking like 120 millimeters in just pure girth on this thing, and that's just too big. Even with fly, you might struggle to get this thing to move effectively on a sufficiently terrain dense board. This is very individual, local meta dependent. If you have a very dense board, then as your standard board layouts, this guy can't move. Even with fly, even with movement 12, he's going to struggle to get around, and you just don't want that, right? But if you've got a less dense board, if you play with less terrain for whatever reason, then the Terrorgeist might have some play, and might go to actually cake. But for me, I think his base is a little bit too big, and it really holds back his potential. But he's definitely playable, right? If we look at this, like, Strip Spice is like borderline broken tier. Actually cake is like, cool, these are playable and really good. These are strong choices for your list. Belandry Bloomer is B tier, right? These are completely fine, very takeable monsters in your list. And, with death, you only have 2. Right, so it's very takeable for death, in general, because if you want a monster, it's one of your two options, and it's a pretty darn good one. But then we get to the Vortex Beast, and I have two. And the reason I've got two here is because it depends on how your TO does this. So the FAQ a while back reduced the price of a Vortex Beast to, I believe, 245 points. And this is likely a mistake. That's way too low. And at 245 points, I think this guy's S tier. For that many wounds, the damage output, this thing is insane. You would always take this at that point. However, that is not intended. I think this is just, nobody has ever ruled this as being 245 points. WARCRY does not consider that a valid change to the game, so they have not changed the points to 245. So if you go with that, the actual Vortex Beast is Molly Damper. This thing's terrible. This thing's awful, especially in the context of Chaos. You have all the best monsters. This thing's fucking terrible. You would never take this. He looks great. He looks wonderful. I love the look of the Vortex Beast, but he's bad. He's not good. He's too expensive. His stats are middling at best. For his points, you would never take him. You would take a Chimera, you would take a Gorgon, you would take a Psygo, like you would take a Hell Pit even, right? You would never take this thing. It's just dreadful. But then we get to the final monster. The final monster is the Zombie Dragon. Now, this is a bit biasy. So, like, I know that many Death players prefer the Terrorgeist, and they would do this and have the Zombie Dragon and Bloomer, Terrorgeist, and actually Cake. But for me, actually, I prefer this. So for me, the Zombie Dragon is my preferred Death monster, simply because it is more killy, right? It has a fantastic quad that can just nuke a deployment. It can nuke an objective. The quad is very powerful. If you're already in combat and don't need to use Dragon Maul, it has razor sharp claws, so it can just rend you into tiny pieces because it gets +3 attacks on its attacks, and it already has 5. So the Zombie Dragon is swinging in with like 8 attacks with its disgustingly good melee profile, and it just deletes whatever you want dead basically every time. And because of the change to counter, which I think really does elevate it from Boulangerie Bloomer into actually Cake, is that counter has been changed, so now you can't counter it as effectively, so it's not whiffing rolls and taking like 16 damage from a really bad roll from counter. That's not happening now. So it just vibes and murders, and it still has fly. It can increase its move on a double, I believe. So this thing has a lot of movement to get around, like the Terrorgeist, but its AoE ability is more powerful and it's better in combat. It is more expensive though. It's like 40 points more, and that's a hefty price increase because this thing's 540 points, which is staggeringly high. But this is a Death monster, so you might think, oh well, 540, you can't fit in a 7-man list, so you've got to go down to 6, right? No, not even close. There are so many warbands in Death that can field a Zombie Dragon and still hit 7, which is great, especially when one of those lists contains Zondara and her zombies, which, if you know Zondara, she allows her zombies to move for free, which then just it multiplies your activation weight beyond the 9 of a 7-man warband and gets closer to like an 11-man weight, which is insane. So I think the Zombie Dragon has a lot of play. I would accept this as well. I think this also works if you consider the Zombie Dragon too expensive and the Terrorgeist to be just that right price for the stats. I'll accept that. But for me personally, I have found much more success paying that extra cost and taking the full-blown dragon. Again, do be aware though, that base is substantial. You will not be able to always get to where you want to go. So bear that in mind. This is still a 120mm base. It is staggeringly large. But that is the tier list for monsters. I think you could maybe jiggle some around. Again, the Zombie Dragon can maybe go to Boulangerie Bloomer. But I do think this is fairly accurate. I don't think you touch any Moldy Damper. These are all bad monsters as a whole for different reasons. The Hell Pit does have some weird synergies, but I think is fairly as is that Chaos Gargant. But everything above Blangy Bloomer is very playable, I think. The Ale Guzzler Gargant is a lot of fun. I love playing him in Destruction. The Terrorgeist is great. Actually, Cake, these are all just, you can just play these. Right, none of these are broken. In my opinion, these are all very playable and very fun in their own way. They bring something cool to the table that I think anyone would enjoy playing with and most would enjoy playing against. Time will tell if the Dankhold becomes truly dominant. He hasn't yet. I think people are experimenting and are finding enjoyment by playing into him and with him, but I don't think he breaks the game. And then straight up Spice, like, yeah, the full powered mega cheap Vortex Beast, yeah, that's a bit of an issue. I don't think the Gorgon's an issue. I think it's just really powerful. The Chimera will forever be an issue, right? Honestly, if there was another tier, I would maybe put in the Chimera up there by itself, because its small base, massive profile, and fly is comically high, right? It's comical amounts of damage. He's way too good. And if I was to ban a single monster, it would be Chimeras every time, right? Like, everything else can vibe, right? Because they are just playable, right? Like, actually Cake all playable. Gorgon's playable. Like, even Bloomers, Steel Croissants, they're all playable, but they're not broken, right? Even the Moldy Dampers can be played and people will enjoy playing into them because they're not great. The Chimera warps everything around it. It's like the arrow in the knee of Warcry monsters is the fucking Chimera. This thing should be banned, and frankly, nothing else should be. I think the rest could exist, and the game would be absolutely fine. And yeah, I think that really does sum up monsters in a nutshell. That most of them are fine. There's one outlier that is not fine, and the rest are fine. Ideally, Drag and Maul will get changed in the future, though. Drag and Maul is, as an ability, is oppressively good. The damage aside, it's the displacement, right? When you consider the range of Dragon Maul, you consider the size of your base, which takes up, obviously, extends the threat range of Dragon Maul, and that's that you can like pick a guy up from the very boundaries of that ability and then yeet him to the other side of your base. That is a staggering amount of movement, of displacement, that your opponent just can't stop. There's no dice roll for this. It just goes off. You drag and you yoop, off they go. They take a journey. You can just take a model off an objective and then kill them, right? Or not. You don't even have to. The removal from objectives, picking up a treasure carrier and yeeting him into the middle of your warband is disgusting. There are so many things that make Dragon Maul incredibly oppressive to deal with, and it needs some sorting out. Maybe make it into a quad. Keep it as is, make it a quad. That'll be fun. Maybe instead of it being a placement, make it a pull, right? Similar to most other pulls. So you can't just like pick a guy from behind a building and then launch him, right? Across the universe. There's plenty of ways to do it, but once Dragon Maul is sorted, I think that monsters will be much more pleasant to play against as a whole. But even as is, I think in general monsters are kind of in a really good place now, and they have been for a while. I think it really is just that Chimera just chilling there and causing issues for everybody else. Like, get that thing out of here. We're good to go. And that's the end of this video. Let me know in the comments down below whether you are going to run monsters going forward, what you think of monsters, or if you think monsters are broken or beyond the scope and scale of Warcry and you just don't want to see them in the game ever again. While you are down there, be sure to hit subscribe and leave a like. And until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra. Welcome to the post-toast credits. A massive shout out to all of my patrons and members, but an extra big shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers: Andy Morris, Blah Blah Blah, Brioche, the Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Lord Fireaxe, Maps, Sable Saver, Steve Bean, the Houston Toad, and Velas. Thank you all for continuing to support this shit show of a channel, and I'll catch you all next time.